They called it the Railway Age, and it transformed everything. Villages became towns, towns became cities, and morgues became very busy indeed. Between 1840 and 1890, Britain's railways killed with remarkable efficiency, trains with no brakes, carriages with no communication, compartments with no escape, the working classes packed into open wagons like cattle, exposed to weather, sparks, and sudden death. The wealthy fared better, but not by much. When disaster struck, everyone burned together. This is the story of how Victorian Britain's greatest achievement became one of history's deadliest gambles. Climb aboard if you dare. The 1840s saw Britain gripped by a fever that made fortunes and destroyed lives in almost equal measure. Railway mania, they called it, and the name barely captured the madness. Speculators poured money into new railway companies. Engineers surveyed routes across every county. Parliament approved line after line, and the landscape transformed with astonishing speed. By 1850, over 6,000 miles of track crisscrossed the nation, connecting cities that had once seemed impossibly distant. Manchester to Liverpool in under 2 hours, London to Birmingham before lunch. The railways promised a revolution in how ordinary people lived, worked, and traveled. What they delivered was something more complicated and considerably more deadly. The railway companies operated with one overriding priority, and it wasn't passenger safety. Profit drove every decision, from the cheapest possible construction to the most dangerous operating practices. These were not nationalized services run for public benefit. They were private enterprises competing fiercely for traffic and investment. Corners were cut everywhere. Track was laid too quickly. Bridges were built too cheaply. Rolling stock was maintained too rarely. The companies answered to shareholders, not passengers, and shareholders wanted dividends. The class system that defined Victorian society extended onto every platform and into every carriage. First-class passengers traveled in enclosed compartments with padded seats, glass windows, and oil lamps for evening journeys. They paid premium fares and received something approaching comfort. Second class offered wooden seats and partial protection from the elements. But third class, where the working poor traveled, was something else entirely. In the early decades, third class meant open wagons with no roofs, no seats, and no sides. Passengers stood or sat on the floor, exposed to rain, wind, coal smoke, and sparks from the engine. They were transported like livestock, because that was precisely how the railway companies viewed them. The Gladstone Act of 1844 forced companies to provide at least one covered train daily for third-class passengers at a penny per mile. The companies complied grudgingly, scheduling these parliamentary trains at the most inconvenient hours and attaching the cheapest possible carriages. Even after roofs appeared, third class remained brutal: wooden benches without backs, no heating in winter, no lighting after dark. Packed bodies generating the only warmth available. The message was clear: if you couldn't afford better, your comfort and your safety were your own concern. The tracks themselves presented dangers that modern travelers cannot easily imagine. There was no standardization across the network. Different companies used different gauges, different signaling systems, and different operating rules. Trains from one company sometimes could not run on another company's tracks. Where lines did connect, chaos reigned at junctions. Signals were primitive semaphores, often hard to see and easily misread. Many lines operated on the time interval system, sending trains at fixed intervals and simply hoping nothing went wrong between them. There was no way to know if the line ahead was clear. There was no way to communicate between train and station once a journey began. The locomotives themselves were marvels of engineering and at the same time, potential bombs on wheels. Boiler explosions killed drivers, firemen, and nearby passengers without warning. The science of metallurgy was still developing, and boilers sometimes failed catastrophically under pressures they should have handled easily. When a boiler burst, the result was devastating. Scalding steam, shrapnel, and fire engulfed everything nearby. Drivers knew the risks but had few options. Working on the railways paid better than most alternatives, and men queued for dangerous jobs because dangerous work put food on the table. Perhaps the most astonishing danger was the most basic. Victorian trains had no continuous braking system. The engine had brakes. The tender behind it sometimes had brakes, but the passenger carriages rolling behind had nothing at all. When the driver needed to stop, he could only slow the engine and hope the momentum of the unbraked carriages behind did not push him forward regardless. Guards positioned in brake vans at intervals along the train watched for the driver's whistle and applied handbrakes manually. The system was slow, unreliable, and frequently fatal. Emergency stops were essentially impossible. Drivers saw obstacles ahead and could do almost nothing but whistle frantically and pray. Communication between carriages was equally non-existent. Once a train departed, passengers were sealed inside their compartments until the next station. If someone fell ill, if a crime occurred, if a fire broke out, there was no way to alert the crew, no cord to pull, no bell to ring, no means of reaching any other human being until the train chose to stop. Passengers were locked into small wooden boxes, hurtling through the countryside at speeds up to 60 miles per hour, entirely cut off from help of any kind. The compartment that provided privacy also provided a perfect trap. The doors on Victorian railway carriages opened outward, and they did not lock properly. Passengers fell from moving trains with horrifying regularity. Some were pushed, some leaned out and misjudged. Some simply lost their balance when carriages lurched. The railway companies knew this happened constantly, but refused to install inward opening doors or proper locks because both would cost money. Coroners recorded verdict after verdict of accidental death, and nothing changed. The falls continued, the bodies accumulated, the shareholders received their dividends. Coupling between carriages relied on simple chains and hooks that failed under stress. Trains literally came apart while moving, leaving rear sections stranded on the tracks while front sections continued obliviously forward. The stranded carriages might roll backward on any gradient, gathering speed with no brakes to stop them. Guards could only watch in horror as their section careened toward disaster. Following trains had no warning that stationary carriages blocked their path. The resulting collisions killed dozens at a time. The fragile couplings betrayed passengers and crew. Gaslighting turned every crash into a potential cremation. Railway companies installed gas reservoirs beneath carriages to fuel the lamps that illuminated evening journeys. When carriages derailed and splintered, the gas ignited. Wooden carriages became furnaces. Passengers trapped in wreckage burned alive, while rescuers struggled to reach them. The screams of the burning haunted survivors for decades. Everyone knew gaslighting was dangerous. Everyone knew wooden carriages were death traps in fires. Nothing changed because change required investment, and investment reduced profits. The disasters accumulated like a catalog of Victorian negligence. The Clayton Tunnel crash of 1861 killed 23 when two trains collided inside the tunnel because the signaling system failed and the signalman panicked. The Abergele disaster of 1868 killed 33 when a passenger train plowed into runaway goods wagons carrying paraffin oil. The fire burned for hours. Bodies were recovered as charred fragments, identified only by personal effects that somehow survived the flames. The Tay Bridge disaster of December 1879 shocked the entire nation. The bridge across the Tay estuary in Scotland was a marvel of engineering, the longest in the world when completed. On a stormy night, the central spans collapsed as a train crossed, plunging locomotive, carriages, and 75 souls into the freezing waters below. There were no survivors. The subsequent inquiry revealed catastrophic design flaws, substandard materials, and inadequate inspection. The engineer, Thomas Bouch, had built his reputation on the bridge. He died within a year, broken by the disaster that bore his name. 10 years later, the Armagh rail disaster demonstrated that nothing had truly changed. On June 12, 1889, a Sunday school excursion train stalled on a steep gradient in Ireland. The crew decided to divide the train, taking the front portion to the summit and returning for the rear. but the rear section's brakes were inadequate. The carriages rolled backward down the hill, gathering terrible speed. A following train, unaware of the danger, was climbing the same gradient. The collision killed 80 people, most of them children on their Sunday school outing. Tiny bodies were pulled from the wreckage for hours. The compartment system that sealed passengers into small enclosed spaces created another uniquely Victorian horror: railway murder. The first widely publicized case came in 1864 when Thomas Briggs, a banker, was attacked, robbed, and thrown from a train between Bow and Hackney Wick. He was found dying on the tracks. His attacker long vanished into the London night. The killer, Franz Müller, was eventually captured and hanged, but the case terrified the traveling public. Anyone could enter your compartment. Anything could happen. There was no way to summon help, no way to escape, no way to know if the person sitting opposite intended violence. Further murders followed. Women were particularly vulnerable, trapped alone with male strangers in compartments where screams went unheard above the noise of the train. The newspapers reported each case with lurid detail, stoking public fear, while railway companies insisted the problem was exaggerated. Ladies' compartments were eventually introduced on some lines, but they were optional and often unavailable. The fundamental design flaw remained. Passengers were sealed into isolation and left entirely to fate. Newspaper campaigns demanded reform, but Parliament moved with glacial slowness. Railway companies wielded enormous political influence. They employed thousands of workers whose votes mattered. They contributed to political campaigns. They entertained members of Parliament lavishly. When safety legislation was proposed, company lobbyists descended on Westminster with arguments about cost, impracticality, and the threat to Britain's industrial competitiveness. Continuous braking systems existed and worked well, but companies claimed the expense was prohibitive. Communication cords were simple technology, but companies insisted passengers would abuse them. The excuses piled up while the deaths continued. The Armagh disaster finally broke the political deadlock. 80 dead, most of them children, and the cause was entirely preventable. The public outcry was overwhelming. Newspapers that had campaigned for years seized the moment, publishing detailed accounts of the catastrophe and demanding immediate action. Members of Parliament who had previously sided with railway interests found their positions untenable. The pressure became irresistible. Within months, the Regulation of Railways Act of 1889 passed into law, and Victorian rail travel began its slow transformation from death trap to something approaching safety. The act mandated three crucial changes that should have come decades earlier. First, continuous automatic braking on all passenger trains. The Westinghouse air brake system, already proven effective in America and on some British lines, became compulsory. Now, when a driver applied the brakes, every carriage in the train slowed simultaneously. Emergency stops became possible. The mathematics of momentum and disaster finally shifted in favor of survival. Second, the act required absolute block signaling across the network. No train could enter a section of track until the previous train had cleared it completely. Signalmen communicated by telegraph, confirming movements and ensuring separation. The time interval system that had killed so many was finally consigned to history. Trains no longer hurtled blindly into occupied sections. The network gained eyes and ears. Third, the act mandated communication between passengers and crew. The cord, a simple chain running the length of the train, allowed any passenger to alert the driver by pulling it. The cord activated a whistle and applied the brakes. Passengers trapped with attackers or facing medical emergencies could finally summon help. The sealed compartment remained, but its deadliest feature was neutralized. The cord cost almost nothing to install. Its absence had cost lives beyond counting. The death rates began to fall almost immediately. Railway companies that had claimed safety improvements were impossible or unaffordable discovered they were neither. The continuous brake worked reliably. The block system functioned smoothly. The communication cord was rarely abused. The apocalyptic claims of company lobbyists proved entirely false, as arguments designed to protect profits over people so often do. Passengers noticed the difference. Confidence slowly returned. Additional reforms followed in subsequent decades. Steel carriages gradually replaced wooden ones, dramatically improving crash survivability. Gaslighting gave way to electric lamps, eliminating the fire risk that had cremated so many. Automatic couplings replaced the chains and hooks that had allowed trains to separate at speed. Each improvement addressed a specific danger that had killed specific people in specific disasters. The reforms were written in blood. The Board of Trade, long a toothless regulator captured by the industry it supposedly supervised, gained real investigative powers. Accident inquiries became thorough and public. Inspectors named causes, assigned blame, and recommended changes. Railway companies could no longer bury their failures in confidential reports or corrupt coroners' verdicts. Transparency brought accountability, and accountability drove improvement. By the early 20th century, British railways had transformed from among the most dangerous forms of transport to among the safest. The journey from London to Edinburgh that once carried genuine mortal risk became routine and unremarkable. Passengers read newspapers and dozed in seats, entirely unconcerned about boiler explosions, coupling failures, or murder in sealed compartments. The terror faded from living memory. The dead were forgotten, but they should not be forgotten. The factory workers who rode in open wagons through winter storms because they could not afford better. The children of Armagh, whose Sunday school outing ended in crushing darkness. The passengers who burned alive in wooden carriages while gas-fed flames consumed everything. The women attacked in compartments where no one could hear their screams. The drivers who knew their boilers might explode but worked anyway because their families needed food. These people paid the price for the safety we inherit. Every modern safety standard traces its lineage to Victorian catastrophe. The regulations that protect today's rail passengers exist because earlier passengers died in sufficient numbers to force change. The comfortable, reliable, safe journey we take for granted was purchased with decades of suffering, scandal, and preventable death. The railways did not become safe because companies chose conscience over profit. They became safe because the bodies piled too high to ignore. The Victorian railways represented both the best and worst of their age, extraordinary engineering ambition paired with extraordinary corporate callousness, the power to transform a nation paired with the refusal to protect its citizens, progress and horror, advancement and neglect, wonder and death, rolling together down the same iron tracks. When you next board a train, remember those who died to make your journey safe. They had no continuous brakes, no communication cord, no steel carriages. They had only speed, hope, and terrible vulnerability. Their sacrifice echoes in every regulation that keeps you alive.